All right. Hello, Joshua. Hello, everyone.
Oh,
Uh, welcome at my channel.
thank you very much.
So,
Thanks
just
for having me.
yeah, just a quick introduction. We met us on Facebook, and we agreed tonight to have this conversation. We invited also Jack to come, but he didn't have StreamYard, so we decided to have it just between us two. And maybe you like to say some short words about yourself, your beliefs, and then we start with your presentation.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks again for having me on. Looking forward to this. Yeah. So I'm Joshua. I'm based in the UK. Perhaps unsurprisingly, I'm a Christian. I'm actually a musician by background, but I've done a bit of scientific study, a few different courses, Open University. So I do have a kind of a loose science background as well. But in terms of this sort of topic, I've always been interested in sort of evolutionary science, biology. That's kind of my main interest in this area. So I've changed my mind quite a bit in the past. I suppose quite a few years ago, I took a more of a theistic evolutionary perspective, and then after reading quite a bit around this area, I kind of started to come around to the idea of ID. So that's the kind of position I hold at the moment, and I hold it tentatively. Always open to being persuaded otherwise, but it's just a really interesting topic, just because it touches so many different areas. Philosophy of science is, I love philosophy of science. It's a really big interest for me, and obviously the biological side, and to some extent the theological side as well. But that in some ways that's a little bit separate. But yeah, so that's just a brief background. Shall we start the
Yes,
slides, or shall I go?
yes, yes,
So
yeah.
yeah, so I was just thinking of perhaps a bit of material to use to start some discussion. So I kind of settled on this paper, which I run an ID blog actually. So I wrote a few blog posts on this paper a while ago. I think it's a really good paper actually, just because it opens up lots of different issues. So Jeffrey Kopersky is a philosopher of science, and he's a Christian himself actually. But he's sort of a critic of ID, but he's a friendly critic really. So I think he makes quite a few interesting points. So I think they're worth discussing. So this paper is quite a well-known paper actually. It's it's cited a lot in some of the other literature. So I thought we'd use this just to bounce off a few ideas. So if you go to the next one, that'd be great. Our time's low. Cheers.
Okay.
So the main idea behind the paper is Kopersky. He kind of looks at 4 different areas, and he suggests there's kind of 2 particular bad ways that are used to attack ID, which get used a lot in discussions and debates. So I'll cover those in a second, and then he kind of looks at 2 other ways to attack ID, which he believes are kind of more promising avenues of critique. So the first kind of area are kind of to do with the more rhetorical side of the debate. So the accusations of creationism and the area of methodological naturalism as well. So I've got this quote here just so you can see where he's coming from in general. So he says, "Let me say up front, I'm no apologist for intelligent design movement. I'm not in favour of teaching ID in public schools, nor am I overly optimistic about its prospects as a research programme." So he's no friend of ID really. He's a critic, but like I said, I think he's quite fair-minded with a lot of his points, even though I disagree with quite a lot of it. So if we go to the first area, which is kind of to do with the rhetorical strategies that are often used. So this is guilt by association and motive mongering, this is kind of the accusation that ID is just a species of creationism. So it's it's often an insult that's thrown at ID proponents, intelligent design creationists, things like that. And then that kind of gets into the politics of it. So Kopsky points out, that most of these accusations, they're logical fallacies. They don't really address the issue. At most, they amount to ad hominem attacks. So, the first point, it's just completely irrelevant to the truth of ID. Even if ID was a species of creationism, it doesn't really tell us anything about whether ID is true. So that's one point he makes. And like I said, it's pretty much just a rhetorical strategy. And it's obviously often substitute for argument, just to avoid the details of the issues. And the other point he makes, it's got an ambiguous meaning as well. I mean, if you look at the ID movement, it's often said that ID is a broad tent, and you can see it in the sense that you have some ID proponents like Paul Nelson, for example, Marcus Ross, who are young Earth creationists, and then on the other hand, you've got guys like Michael Behe, who are almost on the other end of the spectrum in terms of what they're willing to accept. They accept an old Earth. They accept common descent. Behe accepts common descent. So that shows you that there's just a huge amount of equivocation with the creationist accusation. And then I suppose one of the other points. This is what Kopsky mentions. Is that a lot of the critics of ID themselves, they have anti-theological motives, and if creationism invalidates ID, then surely these anti-theological motives invalidate their views. So it's kind of two can play that game really. Of course, that there are some ID critics who are Christians themselves, so that can't be leveled at those sorts of critics. But so yeah, that's kind of his basic points in this area. Do you want to discuss that a bit more? Do you want me to carry on through?
Would you agree that creationism starts actually with a religious book? It can be the Bible or the Quran or whatever other religion makes a creation account, and from there it tries to prove what that religious book actually says. And intelligent design doesn't actually require no religious book at all. It starts from the evidence in nature and goes from there, and then permits the evidence to lead wherever it is. And it doesn't exclude intelligent design like methodological naturalism does a priori, where intelligence is not even permitted to be mentioned as a possible causal agency. So it is really separate. Of course, there are those which mix both things and say, it's intelligent design creationism. But I think that the approach is different. And intelligent design doesn't actually mention a specific deity. It just states that intelligence is the better causal explanation of what we see in nature rather than natural mechanisms.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Yeah, I mean, there's so much more that can be said about this area. All the debates around, it's kind of unique to America as well. Some of these political debates, around the Dover trial and things like that. The other point is, just looking at it from a historical perspective. If you actually look at the origins of ID, you look at some of the key members like Michael Behe, Philip Johnson, and the reason why they kind of came to ID position, and they're completely not completely. They might have various reasons, but at least the primary motive were scientific motives. Behe himself, he mentions, it was Michael Denton's work who originally got him interested in ID and thinking about these critiques of neo-Darwinism. And to my knowledge, I think Michael Denton, he's not a theist, is he? I think he's agnostic. I'm pretty sure that's the case. I don't know if you know any different. The same for Philip Johnson as well. He tells this account of how he was. I think he was like looking outside a bookshop or something, and he saw Richard Dawkins' The Blind Watchmaker, and next to that was Michael Denton's Evolutionary Theory in Crisis, and he read both of those, and it just got him thinking about possibility of intelligent design. So I mean, there's other ID proponents, isn't there, of course, like Dembski and Meyer, but just looking at that from a historical perspective as well, it's looking at their motives in particular. So that's another point there, I think. But yeah, there's loads that can be said about this, isn't there?
Oh yes, sure.
Yeah. So, yeah, okay. I'll talk a little bit about this next point. This is another huge area. I suppose in future we could have sort of separate discussions on these particular points, couldn't we? To go in a bit more detail, perhaps with someone with a different perspective. So the next point that Kopsky looks at is methodological naturalism. So this is whether it's a ground rule for science or is it a meta-theoretic shaping principle. And he says, historical confrontations between naturalistic and design hypotheses were settled by inference to the best explanation. So he's saying that, rather than people appealing to these philosophical principles, the issues are often settled using different criteria. I suppose, explanatory scope and things like that are often thrown into the mix as well. So I suppose, this all depends on how you define methodological naturalism, because sometimes I've heard it defined as, science excludes supernatural causation, or sometimes it's just defined more in terms of, we can only appeal to natural causes. So there's a little bit of equivocation there, because that leaves the question of how do we categorize intelligence? Is that a natural cause, or is that a supernatural cause? Is it something in between? So it's kind of a difficult issue to balance sometimes as well. I don't know what you think about that distinction, Artangelo.
Well, I am a theist, but I think that methodological naturalism applied to operational science is okay, because if you investigate how a protein works and what its function is, then you are not going to presuppose that eventually some deity is fiddling there and doing something. You presuppose that just natural occurrences are there. And then it's perfectly fine that we use methodological naturalism. And when we apply the same to historical sciences, there I think that the problem relies, because we do not have only natural mechanisms as a possible explanation. So I think all the possible explanations should be put on the table, and then all of them should be scrutinized to check what actually best makes sense. And I think there is the big problem, which we disagree with the current scientific framework, where intelligent design is actually excluded a priori by the excuse that supernatural agents cannot be tested in the lab. And of course, we cannot test God's action, because we believe that the act of creation in the past is a unique event and it will not be repeated. So I think there is the problem.
Yeah. No, those are good points. Yeah, I think for me, of course, in practice, it's difficult to know, how to test a supernatural agency. But I think in theory, it is possible. I think there's a great quote by Philip Kitcher, who's I don't know if you've read any of his stuff. He's a critic of ID, I think, a philosopher of science. He mentions that postulating an unobserved creator need be no more unscientific than postulating unobserved particles. So especially things in quantum physics where they're so immaterial and mysterious. Another point is, if you look at kind of the prayer experiments, I don't know if you've ever looked into the literature on that a little bit.
No.
Martin Baudry, he argues that it is possible to test the efficacy of prayer. Some of these experiments, you could in theory set up certain tests to test certain sample groups and things like that. And so I think in principle it is possible, but it's just difficult in practice. But I don't think it's directly relevant to the ID stuff, really, because essentially ID isn't necessarily inferring a supernatural design, is it? It's just inferring intelligence. Obviously, you can argue about the nature of the intelligence, but
of course you can propose aliens, you can propose Santa Claus, pixies, whatever you want. The key issue here is that there is a differentiation between non-intelligent natural mechanisms, which usually are evolution or physical necessity, or simply chance or chemical reactions, in contrast to an intelligence which is actually directing and instantiating what we see in nature. So no,
that's right. So I think in his paper, Coppersky, he goes into a bit more detail on this. So I think you can put a link in the YouTube thing, can't you, of the paper? And I mean, my post that I wrote on it, they were quite detailed, but they don't go through all the points.
If you have a link, you can put it in the private chat, and then I'll put it here in the public chat.
Should be able to do that. Shall I do it now or a bit later on?
Up to you. Whatever you think is.
I don't want to ruin the course. So I might do it afterwards. But I'll probably do a bit of a write up on this as well, just to expand on a few other points. So I mean, the other point he mentions is methodological naturalism. It can't really be seen as a ground rule for science because, again, if you look historically, most of the models and theories and laws historically have been subject to change. From naturalism has had a different understanding over this history of science as well. Going back to Newton and things like that, what they thought wasn't allowed within a naturalistic framework, and now said to be natural causes, aren't they? So I think certainly that rules that out. We can't just see it as a ground rule, but you could argue that it's a meta-theoretic shaping principle. So it's just another term for it is provisory naturalism, isn't it? It's in general we want to try and appeal to natural causes as much as possible, but in principle we could appeal to non-natural causes, supernatural causes, if the evidence necessitated it. I don't know what you think about that distinction. In terms
of the thing is, I have seen atheists and proponents of evolution saying, well, we try everything which is possible to explain things in natural ways. But then, of course, the question is, when is the threshold arrived where you have to say, well, natural causes are not sufficient to explain what we are observing in nature? And that is the key point. That is the point now where we should actually say supernatural or intelligent causation is a better explanation. So where do you actually make that threshold? And I mean, I had recently some conversations at atheist channels with atheists, and then I gave them the number of the probability to have a small peptide or protein by random chance. And when you say it's 1 to the 10th to the 50th power, then they say, oh, so it's not impossible. There is still a chance. I mean, so where do you put the line when you say, no, this is truly, the odds are far too big and it's far too unlikely that life or that protein could have emerged by natural means, so it is better to explain it with supernatural means. So where do you make that differentiation? Where do you say, until here it's natural, but starting from here it is supernatural?
Those are great points. I agree with that. So the points that are on the screen now, they're kind of his main points, but I've got loads of other points down here that we could talk about. I suppose the difficulty is if we allow intelligent agency into science, then how do we predict how intelligences are going to operate in terms of the causes? So does that make predictability a
That
difficulty
is a
within
big,
science?
that is a big question, and I have been questioned in regards of this. And the critique was that, well, you cannot test intelligent design, and of course you cannot test it because we
Yeah.
are talking here about things that supposedly happened in the deep past, and which are unique events, and so we cannot put God to act in a test tube and to repeat the origin of life there and say, okay, God did it again here in the lab, so we can
Yeah.
say that it has been confirmed. That will, of course, never going to happen. So this is, of course, a limitation which we have, and that's why I think that abductive reasoning to the best explanation is one of the ways which we can use as epistemic foundation, but as well eliminative induction to say, well, natural explanations simply are not adequate to explain what we are seeing in nature. Therefore, since there is just a dichotomy, there are two possible explanations, then the alternative, which is design, is a better explanation.
Yeah, and that's going back to this issue of these philosophical ground rules for science. They're not the only things. We can appeal to the best explanation, can't we? So that's another thing we can appeal to. But yeah, now that's interesting. I think so these two main points. These are kind of more brief ones. I think the last 2 points we can get into a bit more detail on those. So I think I'll go to the next one actually.
Okay.
We can always come back to these, can't we, another time?
Yeah,
So on the second half of the paper, he advances what he thinks are two good ways to attack ID, and his first point is this issue of soft and hard anomalies. So basically, what he's saying is intelligent design theory. It presents biological systems that perhaps are a bit mysterious. They don't quite fit in with evolutionary theory. Well, at least Darwinism, neo-Darwinism. So they are problematic in that sense. But he classifies them as soft anomalies. So they're not problems that necessitate a huge theory change. Jumping from evolutionary theories to intelligent design. So this gets into discussion about biological systems themselves, bacteria, flagellum, irreducible complexity, origin of life, things like that. So that's his argument here. So I don't know what's your initial thought on that. I don't know if you've come across this distinction before.
Well, the thing is that evolution obviously is the main focus in regards of biodiversity, while intelligent design is actually a proposition which englobes questions in regards of all origins issues. That starts with the origin of the universe, with the laws of physics, with fine-tuning of the universe, origin of life, biodiversity, and consciousness. And I think morality maybe is just philosophic. It doesn't have to do with teleological arguments, but basically 7, 8 key issues which are englobed in regards of intelligent design. So, what would be the competitor in regards of intelligent design? I would say it's evolution and also chance, undirected natural occurrences, and physical necessity. I think these are the alternative mechanisms if one is going to exclude intelligent design. What do you think?
No, that's a good point. That's not something I put on my initial response, but that's a good point. I think my main problem with this was my thought was to question this distinction between soft and hard anomalies, because it's kind of a vague distinction, isn't it? What's the threshold from where you get these mysterious anomalies within certain scientific theories? At what point do we then say, right, we've got to adjust the theory a little bit? Because I think in practice, science just doesn't work that way. We don't. You don't often have this kind of logical necessity that like a disproof, especially in biology, it's kind of hard to. I mean, I know some people respond, if we find a Precambrian rabbit, then that'll falsify evolution. But would that really be the case? I mean, just one anomaly like that, would that overthrow the whole theory? I think there would just be
I don't think so. They would just. We have seen it so many times that something which was not predicted simply was discovered, and then it was accommodated. I mean, like convergent evolution. How do you explain that the octopus eye has a similar architecture like the human eye, or similar eyes even in unicellular life forms, which are very similarly constructed as our eyes? So how do you explain that? I mean, evolution should be only happening in one specific directory once, and not in parallel in different ways. And I mean, then it simply claimed, my eyesight happened many different times, and that's simply just so. These are just so assertions, but they are not backed up by evidence.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. There's always, an auxiliary hypothesis you can add onto the theory to accommodate this new data. So I just think it's it's an unrealistic requirement for science. This idea of having hard anomalies, and then that's the point where you, and like I said, it's that where's the threshold? You'd have to point out that there's I suppose with a cumulative case, when you start to get more and more of these systems piling on top of each other, then you have to start to say, but we need to go back to the drawing room. And essentially that's what ID does. It's saying, we have so many of these types of systems that we're finding in the biological world that, defy these explanations. And, despite all the progress that's been made, we've just not made any progress in terms of explaining these in terms of these natural processes. So, yeah, I mean, just on that topic, actually, that you were talking about before, there's a great quote by Cornelius Hunter. Have you come across his stuff before? He's written a few books, and he's I think he blogs quite a lot. I can't remember what the blog's called. I think it's Darwin's God or something like that. And he writes, being an evolutionist means there's no bad news. If new species appear abruptly in the fossil record, that just means evolution operates in spurts. If species then persist for eons with little modification, that just means evolution takes long breaks. If clever mechanisms are discovered in biology, that just means evolution is smarter than we imagined. If strikingly similar designs are found in distant species, that just means evolution repeats itself. If significant differences are found in allied species, that just means evolution sometimes introduces new designs rapidly, and it goes on like that. I think it's absolutely true that, and that's kind of what you were saying just then, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's why evolution basically has turned itself into a non-falsifiable theory. It is always right. Whatever new evidence comes up, it is always accommodated, and also because. If the framework of science is methodological naturalism, then you have no alternative. Then you have whatever shows up, you have always to accommodate it through evolution. And that makes it unfalsifiable.
Yeah. And I think, to be fair, falsifiability, I don't think it's an essential demarcation criteria for science. I think testability is the main the main important thing there. But I think if a theory is falsifiable and testable, that's even stronger, isn't it? But I know that's kind of quite rare to come across that. But and I think just to perhaps finish on this point, when it comes to ID, we're not just, like I said, we're not just talking about one or two slightly puzzling systems, aren't we? We're talking about kind of gross theoretical inadequacy, aren't we? Right across the board in terms of these irreducibly complex systems. So I think ID proponents, they're putting across this cumulative case where these, if you want to make this distinction about soft and hard anomalies, there's so many of these anomalies piling on top of each other that I think it is justified that we do need a theory change. and I know to some extent, this isn't an either-or thing. It's not evolution or design. Obviously, evolution takes place regardless, but it's whether we need evolution plus design, isn't it? We need to kind of throw that into the mix to explain some of these broader issues. I don't know what your thoughts on that is.
Well, I think this is an important point, an important aspect which you brought up, Joshua, that, I mean, we do not deny evolution in a general sense. We know that evolution actually occurs in biology, but it doesn't occur in the extent that is actually being claimed it does. And it certainly doesn't explain the big complexity and organismal architecture and the 3D architecture of life forms. And I think that adaptation, this is something that we see actually happening, and speciation of secondary degree, this is also something which has been observed, so this is not in dispute. But what is being disputed is common ancestry and the claim that from bacteria to man, only evolution was the causal mechanism which brought forward all that biodiversity. And I mean, I had recently 2 debates in regards of irreducible complexity, and then my opponents, they claimed, I mean, they claimed, we have these 2 systems, and they actually have demonstrated to have evolved. These are irreducible complex systems that have evolved. Therefore, the entire hypothesis has to be reformulated. And I mean, I had my difficulty to assimilate that idea, because I mean, I have during the years described and seen so many systems which we actually do know that they could not have emerged by evolutionary mechanisms, and in special the origin of life. I mean, we know that the cell has a minimal number of parts in order to be alive, and if you go below that threshold, then life is not possible. So the cell or life is is a prime example of irreducible complexity. So I mean, they then accused me, saying that, well, if you are claiming that if a system which is irreducibly complex cannot evolve by definition, then the entire hypothesis is unfalsifiable. And I had actually to think a little bit about what they said. And I mean, he uses in his book, The Edge of Evolution, some examples like with malaria evolution. And he says that there is actually a threshold where evolution can operate up to about 2 mutations or something like that, which would actually require a huge amount of time to fix into the genome. And I mean, that has been a little bit difficult for me, and maybe I am still working on to assimilate these thoughts. So what do you think in regards of that, Joshua?
Yeah, same. A lot of information to take in, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, the irreducible complexity stuff is really fascinating. I don't know, have you read his recent book, Mousetrap for Darwin? Have you come across that one yet?
Which one?
A Mousetrap for Darwin. It's his most recent book.
No, I've not read it yet.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's most of his pre-published stuff anyway. Although I think there is a bit of new material in it. So yeah, no, I'm looking forward to reading that, because that's kind of him addressing critics a bit more. Tim, what are your thoughts on the kind of the definitions of irreducible complexity? Because that's often a cause of controversy. Because I know Behe, obviously he's originated the concept. Well, not completely, but he's the main guy, isn't he? But I know there's been disagreements about how specifically to define it. Because I do think we need to be careful with how we define irreducible complexity. Especially within a scientific framework. I know Bill Dembski, he's kind of expanded on some of Behe's concepts as well.
Yeah, there are 4 different versions as far as I know.
Yeah, because there's one about pathways as well.
Yeah, there are small variations, but in my debates, I've used simply the one which he used in his black box book from 1996.
Yeah.
And I mean, I have still some difficulty to assimilate that an irreducible complex system can actually be the product of evolution.
Yeah.
I have yet difficulty to grasp that it can be both irreducibly complex, but the product of evolution. How do you see that?
Yeah, because you know, it's you know, the issue is about direct Darwinian pathways, isn't it, and versus indirect Darwinian pathways, and you know, then we start to get onto co-option, co-evolution, things like that. Obviously, that's kind of Ken Miller's a big critic on that point, and
Yeah.
what's his name, Alan Orr. You know, but you know, there's all these scaffolding scenarios, and I think I'm just trying to find because I do quite like Dembski's formulation of it because it's a bit more precise. Where is it?
I
Yeah,
can put it here on the screen. I have it.
he defines it as a system performing a given basic function is irreducibly complex if it includes a set of well-matched, mutually interacting, non-arbitrarily individuated parts, such that each part in the set is indispensable to maintaining the system's basic and therefore original function. And then the set of these indispensable parts is known as the irreducible core. So he kind of makes a few more distinctions there, which I think the reason why I prefer Dembski's formulation of it is I think it addresses this issue of co-option and I was reading this particular one the other day. Yeah.
So in
Yeah,
the
that's the
second
one.
one, he says the enhanced definition: a system performing a given basic function is irreducibly complex if it includes a set of well-matched, mutually interacting, non-arbitrary individual parts, such that each part in the set is indispensable to maintaining the system's basic, therefore original function. The set of these indispensable parts is known as the irreducible core of the system.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a bit more of a subtle definition, isn't it? I mean, I think was it a few months ago, Behe was doing a Zoom presentation. Oh yeah, I think it was about his recent book, and I did ask this question about what he thinks of Dembski's reformulation of it, and he didn't get a chance to answer the question, so I was a bit annoyed because I was really curious. But I think I did hear him say once in a talk, someone did ask him, and he said he does kind of accept Dembski's version of it, but you know, when he's talking about it, he just uses his definition. So I think, you know, that's being picky, I suppose. But yeah, so I just think it's important that you know, we be as rigorous as possible with especially the definitions for these. Because they're essential concepts, aren't they? And you know, it's important we get them right as well. Don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, let me put your presentation again here. Shall I move on?
Go.
Next?
Yeah, we can do. Yeah, so
okay.
Yeah.
Next one here.
So these last two slides, these are kind of on the final point that Coppersky makes. Although there's kind of two smaller points within them. So his critique is about the kind of heuristic value of ID and peer review. So he basically says that you know, ID doesn't have significant enough body of peer reviewed literature, and that's kind of, you know, because a lot of the work that ID proponents rely on is often done by non-ID proponents. I don't particularly see a problem in that because, you know, all we're doing is reframing the data and these findings within an ID framework. So I don't. But his point is there isn't kind of specific ID research that goes beyond that. Go on.
It's difficult to do ID research if it is excluded a priori.
Exactly.
And I mean, we know that the Discovery Institute has some papers which are about idea, but that is, I mean, largely ignored, and it is brandmarked as non-scientific because it's idea. So I think the problem is still the foundation, which is excluding idea from the beginning.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Yeah, that's the kind of point I make in my article on this is part of the reason is these lack of incentives, because people know that if they do this, then it can cause a lot of trouble. I know there was that recent peer review paper, wasn't there, in the Journal of Theoretical Biology with did you read that one
recently?
Yeah.
No, I didn't go into the details, but it was good because they landed a little coup because it was in a secular science journal. So of course the Discovery was very happy with it, but it obviously was immediately attacked, and they said they would release a counter paper to object it. That was expected, actually, but I think that the reaction was slim. Actually, it wasn't. But
no, I read the paper. It's really good, and I read some of the responses to it afterwards. But that was quite a big breakthrough, I thought. I think there were two mathematicians, weren't they? I can't remember his name now.
From Norway, I think.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, Ola Hus. I think they're from Norway, definitely.
Yeah, one is I think my Facebook friend, but I look at Höstler or something like that.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. No, it's really good. I mean, the surprising thing is, they're not coy about anything. They mention Behe by name, Dembski by name, and Dodax as well. They use their work to make some of these conclusions. So I think their approach was more framing it in terms of fine tuning in biology. So they did kind of reframe some of the language. But the principles they appeal to are specified complexity, irreducible complexity, things like that. I'm not sure I get the distinction they make though between kind of bottom up and top down design.
Well, I mean I didn't like so much how they applied fine tuning. I mean they took the sequence space and then the fact that functional proteins are rare, and then they said that the sequence was fine-tuned in order to have functionality. And I don't know if fine-tuning would be actually the appropriate description of the fact that only in sequence space just a few sequences are actually functional. Because we have actually better examples of fine-tuning in biology. I would say, in special, the force, the hydrogen force between base pairs, DNA base pairs, and Watson-Crick base pairing. So we know that force has to be fine-tuned. Otherwise, you cannot have the ladder, the DNA ladder, and they don't mention that. And there are some other examples where it would be really appropriate to describe it as fine-tuning. And
genetic code as well, I suppose. And so I wasn't, like I said, I wasn't sure of the way they framed it, but no, I thought it was a great paper.
I mean, the major point was actually that it was published and not rejected in the peer review process. I think that was a little coup that they landed, which was really fun.
I'm surprised it wasn't cancelled. But no, they left it on. So I mean, that's just a recent example, but I think out of all his points, this is probably his strongest one, and I do agree with him to some extent. I think some of the output could be better from some of the ID folks, but again, that's related to the funding issue and the publishing issue as well. My critique of this point, though, was that Kopsky he doesn't mention things like the evolutionary informatics lab and the Biologic Institute. I think at the time he wrote the paper, those avenues weren't up and running. But I had a look at his book, Physics of Theism, which is more recent, and he doesn't even mention it in that. So I think that was a point he should have taken into account as well, because people like Dembski say, the evolution in informatics lab, that constitutes the scientific core of ID. Those research projects are the kind of the main thing, really. Obviously the lab work from Doug Axe and Anne Gager as well. Trying to think of some of the other ones. Are there any other ones?
I don't know. I don't know of any other exclusively ID institute besides Biocomplexity.
Biocomplexity, that's the journal, isn't it? Yeah. So I kind of get his point, but I don't think it's a reason to dismiss ID, because let's not forget it's a young science, and there are all these sociological problems to go along with it as well.
But if you look back, I mean, if we suppose that it started about 25 years ago, I think it went a very, very long way, and it is being successful. I mean, we are here talking about this right now, and there are many channels on YouTube that do so, and on Facebook. So intelligent design is a lively debated issue and topic. So. Yeah. And it has not been simply forgotten. Quite the contrary is the case. So I think it is being very, very successful, even if it is still a young scientific enterprise, let's say. It is, in my understanding, something which is very good and growing in different parts of the world. Actually, we see that in Poland and also in the Nordic countries in Europe, and of course in America. Here in Brazil, it is a very vivid movement of which I am being part. So in some parts of the world, it is doing well, I would say, and it will grow certainly further and more.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. It's it is interesting how because a lot of the debates often focused around America, isn't it? But yeah, it's interesting to see how it's growing in other countries. There's an Italian ID community as well. I think it's very small, but
I know just a couple of people which are seen in the ID YouTube community, and also on Facebook. Very, very few which have some ideas to make some congress and so forth. But it is very little still. It is not something widespread yet. Yeah,
so it's. I think we've got to give them the benefit of the doubt in some respects, and just see how things go. Within the next decade, it'll be interesting to see what the research looks like. So yeah,
I think research might be important, but research is very, very expensive. And I don't know if I actually doing idea research, if that is necessary, because we have so much scientific evidence in the mainstream science papers, which, for example, right now I am studying the biogenesis of the ribosome, and that is something which is a treasure trove for us, because you see so much mechanistic and engineering in the biogenesis of it, and we can use that to elaborate our arguments, and in special when we are talking about things that had to emerge prior to when life started, like the ribosome had to be already fully set up when life started. So an evolution proponent or naturalism proponent, he cannot even come up and say, oh, the ribosome evolved. I mean, when they are doing this, then they are basically giving up what actually biological evolution is about, and use it in a field where it cannot be actually proposed. And that, of course, is a big problem, because if you don't have evolution, then the alternative to intelligent design is random luck. And that exposes, in my understanding, nicely the problem of materialistic causes to explain its origin.
Yeah, no, good points. I think
Okay.
we could go on that point, but I think probably best to move
Yeah,
on.
let's go to the
Yeah,
last of your slideshow. We have, I think, more 10 minutes, and then I think an hour we can end our stream. That would be a
cool.
good time frame. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so this is kind of the final point, really, and I suppose it's related to some of the previous points. So he basically argues that ID it violates a principle of conservatism in science. So basically saying that ID is an unnecessarily radical proposal, and obviously the idea behind this is, when we're doing theory change and things like that, we want to make the smallest adjustments possible to accommodate the data. I think Quine, he calls it the principle of minimal mutilation. lovely phrase. But yeah, so that's the kind of general point there. And his main argument is that even if neo-Darwinian mechanisms fail, there's still live debate about additional natural mechanisms. So we're thinking about the extended evolutionary synthesis, the third way, some of the work by like James Shapiro.
Yeah.
And
the thing is that as long as the naturalistic framework is in place, there will never be a shift from expanding the evolutionary theory and then come to say, okay, now it's the time to propose also intelligence as a causal mechanism in the game. I think it is very difficult that this might happen, but I think the two proposals, they will always walk in parallel. And of course, those which a priori deny a creator, they will always stick to evolution, no matter how uncompelling and unplausible that it is. Because, I mean, if you want to be an atheist, you have somehow to justify your atheism. And the way to go, of course, is evolution and abiogenesis and multiverses and all that kind of alternative explanations, even without evidence and just philosophic. And if you are a theist, then you can actually resort to all that body of knowledge which has been produced in the last decades and substantiate what you believe to be true.
Yeah. No. I mean, I think so. I wouldn't question this sort of principle of conservatism. It's a sensible proposal. So, but I just question whether ID does violate it, because all we're saying is intelligence needs to be added along to these mechanisms. It's not like we have to, like we said, jump ship and completely throw out all the past theories in biology. So, to my mind, ID is the smallest possible step we can make to accommodate these problems that we're facing in the biological world. And I think go on.
No, I agree with you. I think we cannot simply discard everything, because I mean we know that evolution is actually something which is actually even necessary in order for life to exist, and it had to be fully set up and pre-programmed when life started in order for organisms to be able to adapt to the environment. But the thing is that we cannot expand it to an all-encompassing explanation of all biodiversity. That's where the problem is, and also the claim that all life forms are coming from one common ancestor. There are big problems there, and I have listed them. So our work is basically to point out where the problems are in regards of these claims, and then each person makes up its own setup of explanations and so forth.
No, I find it quite interesting. All these additional mechanisms that we can talk about, like niche construction, neutral evolution, and those kind of areas. But I do think, because often ID proponents they'll focus more on the Darwinian side of things. But I do think more in recent years, people like Stephen Meyer, they've addressed these additional mechanisms. I think he does in Darwin's Doubt, doesn't he? He has a few chapters on sort of the extended evolutionary synthesis.
That was a great book for me. Yeah, that was very influential for me as a starting point, actually, to start studying these epigenetic mechanisms, and I have greatly expanded on that. And I have listed now 41 different epigenetic languages which are involved in constructing bodies, and that's a lot. And they obviously add a huge amount of complexity, and that's what I have actually discovered, that life is much more complex and not just reducible to genetic information. It is mainly and primarily epigenetic information, and the genome is basically just a receipt. It's like a library, and the epigenetic information is like a software program which knows where to take the book out of the library and then express the information in each of these books. And the mix is like the spliceosome, which is selecting which part of the genome to splice and then to express, and so forth. So the orchestration is actually integrated. So of course, we know, as Davidson has said that very clearly, if you change just a little bit the gene regulatory network, then things they can break down and they can go havoc, and there is very little range of change. It is something which is fixed and cannot be simply evolved into a different kind of expression sequence. So that is very hard evidence for intelligent design, that kinds or species they had to be made from the beginning, but with a limited ability to speciate and to adapt to the environment.
Yeah. That's interesting. I was going to ask you a question, actually. So, from your perspective, what would you say about the kind of modern status of evolutionary theory? Would you say it's still thoroughly, primarily neo-Darwinian, or would you say, because a lot of critics will say, Darwin's been and gone. Modern evolutionary theory, it's completely moved on. Natural selection is just a small part of modern evolutionary theory in terms of explaining, adaptive evolution. What are your thoughts on that in terms of the kind of balance of the mechanisms?
Well, the thing is that they are expanding actually and trying to assimilate and englobe all these newly discovered mechanisms and languages and codes and so forth, and epigenetics. But the paradigm is not changing, which is, the big question is, can we explain and assimilate all this excluding an intelligent designer? And I think the big problem, and I can read that quickly to you, is that the big umbrella contributor to explain organismal complexity and biodiversity, which falsifies and replaces unguided evolutionary mechanisms, is pre-programmed, prescribed, instructional, complex information encoded through at least 33 variations of genetic codes and 41 epigenetic codes. And complex communication networks use signaling that act on a structural level, and that's the key point. It is on a structural level, in an integrated fashion, and it must be interlocked. And this system is pre-programmed to direct growth and development, respond to nutrition demands, environmental cues, control reproduction, homeostasis, metabolism, defense systems, and cell death. And pre-programming and prescribing a specific outcome is always the result of intention with foresight, able to instantiate a distant specific goal. And foresight comes always from an intelligent agent. Therefore, biodiversity is the result of intelligent design rather than unguided evolution. So I think, in my understanding, this is the paradigm shift. It is three things. It is epigenetic information, genetic information, and signaling networks. And those, they have to work in an integrated fashion together. It is a holistic explanation. It's just not only gene-centered.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, I would say kind of just more generally as well in terms of the future relationship between ID and modern evolutionary theory. I think we do need to look at more into these other mechanisms aside from focusing on natural selection so much, because obviously natural selection, it's the main thing, isn't it? But I think increasingly it's becoming less of an issue. I still think the additional mechanisms they fail to explain. Behe was saying this, in his recent some of his recent discussions. Did you watch his debate with Joshua Swamidass?
No, I didn't.
It's very interesting. Yeah, I'd recommend watching it. It was a couple of months ago, I think. I think it was.
Well, I had some exchange with Swamidass, and I don't like his science, so I'm not very keen to what he has to say. So I'm not focusing much to listen to him,
I think he still says some interesting things, but yeah, he's big on this kind of, don't attack Darwinism. It's completely, in the past, and it kind of, we need to be focusing on these additional mechanisms. But anyway, kind of going off the point there. So yeah, I mean that's they're the basic points of the paper. So I conclude basically saying I still think the two good ways that he proposes, I still think they're pretty bad critiques, generally speaking. So I think there are much stronger objections that we could talk about actually, but maybe that's for another day. Perhaps it'd be good to kind of go into more of the details.
Sure.
I'm very interested in kind of the specified complexity discussion, things like that, and irreducible complexity as well, origin of life.
Yes, I think these are all very, very interesting topics, and they give good discussion points. Yes, we can have. I mean, I am pretending to have 2 or 3 streams on my channel per week, and I think that was a nice interaction with you, Joshua. So thank you very much for coming to my channel.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. Thanks very much for having me.
Yeah, to come again, and then we can eventually share more information and look a little bit into these topics like specified information, irreducible complexity, and whatever, origin of life, and eventually some specific systems. Like I am studying now biogenesis of the ribosome, which I think will take me yet some time, because it is very complex, and it is really fascinating because you discover things which you never imagined that you would actually see in life, like the fact that each single protein of the ribosome, when it is synthesized, it is going through a test drive. And it is, I mean, how do you explain that by natural means, when there was actually not evolution yet to come up with all this? You need to understand what is the right folding of the protein or the ribosomal RNA, and then compare it with what is actually being produced. And then you have to know, oh, this is okay, this is wrong, it's wrong, it goes to the proteasome to be discarded and recycled, or oh, okay, it is okay, it works properly, it can be incorporated in the nascent and maturation of the ribosome. So this is prime evidence of intelligent design, and I've not seen yet the Discovery or whoever else actually exploring that kind of evidence, and it's very powerful. And I mean, the only explanation that atheists and naturalists can give is, oh, we don't know yet, implicitly saying, oh, science will find out, and it certainly will be a natural explanation, or then claiming, oh, it is just an argument from incredulity, or things like that. I mean, I think we are pretty much justified to be incredule that natural, non-guided, non-intelligent mechanisms are capable to come up with what I would describe probably the most complex protein, complex known by us.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. I'd love to hear more about that in the future. You know, when you've done a bit more work on it. So, yeah.
Okay, so thanks to everyone for watching. Thank you, Joshua, for coming and for that
No
good
problem.
discussion tonight. And see you next time. Bye-bye, everyone.
All right. Thanks very much, Artangelo. See you soon.